here in the virtual space. We'll go ahead and jump in. Hello, everyone. I'm Julia, a bookseller with Politics and Prose. We're live with Niall Ferguson and Gillian Tett discussing Doom, the politics of catastrophe. You can follow the link in the chat to purchase the book directly from Politics and Prose. If you have a question this evening, use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions during the last portion of the discussion, though we apologize in advance if we run short on time. Additionally, we're glad to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To enable captions, click the CC live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen. Before we jump in, we do want to thank all of you out there for joining us. We are really grateful to our family of loyal customers who keep our business and our spirits afloat. It's my pleasure to introduce this exciting new book. Disasters are inherently hard to predict. Pandemics like earthquakes, wildfires, financial crises, and wars are not normally distributed. There is no cycle of history to help us anticipate the next catastrophe. But when disaster strikes, we ought to be better prepared than the Romans were when Vesuvius erupted, or medieval Italians when the Black Death struck. We have science on our side, after all. Drawing from multiple disciplines, including economics, cliodynamics, and network science, Doom offers not just a history, but a general theory of disasters, showing why our ever more bureaucratic and complex systems are getting worse at handling them. Doom is the lesson of history that this country, indeed the West as a whole, urgently needs to learn if we want to handle the next crisis better and to avoid the ultimate doom of irreversible decline. Niall Ferguson is one of the world's most renowned historians. He is the author of 16 books, including Civilization, The Great Degeneration, Kissinger, 1923 to 1968, The Idealists, and The Ascent of Money. He is the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, and the Managing Director of Greenmantle LLC. His many prizes include the International Emmy for Best Documentary, the Benjamin Franklin Award for Public Service, and the Council on Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Book Award. Ferguson will be in conversation with Gillian Tett, who serves as the chair of the editorial board and editor-at-large US of the Financial Times. She writes weekly columns covering a range of economic, financial, political, and social issues. She is also the co-founder of FT Moral Money, a twice-weekly newsletter that tracks the ESG revolution in business and finance, which has since grown to be a staple FT product. Ted is the author of The Silo Effect, which looks at the global economy and financial system through the lens of cultural anthropology. Her next book, Anthrovision, A New Way to See Life and Business, will come out in June of this year. On behalf of Politics and Prose, please join me in welcoming Niall Ferguson and Gillian Tett. Thank you both.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Julia, and welcome to everyone who's watching. It's great to have you with us tonight. And welcome to Niall, or I should say Professor Ferguson. Although just to reveal our common British heritage, contrary to all of you who've watched Downton Abbey or The Crown, we actually don't use titles very much when we're talking to each other. So I cannot bring myself to say Professor Ferguson. I'm going to call you Niall. So
please, do go Niall. Ahead, Dr. Tett. I think it's much preferable. Anyways, we're more or less Americanized now, you and I. So we've left behind our inherited peerages.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to talk to you. And it's also, though, somewhat intimidating because, as you've just heard, Niall, or Professor Ferguson, is extraordinarily prolific and extraordinarily erudite in the sweep of topics that he's written about as a historian. In fact, the Financial Times recently did a review of Doom and said that there are few Scots, if you still count yourself as Scottish, few Scots either as talented or industrious as Niall Ferguson. While others spent lockdown learning to bake sourdough or watching Netflix, mostly watching Netflix, my fellow countryman, the Scotsman, was, quote, holed up in the mountains, applying his prodigious intellect to placing the present pandemic on a wider historic canvas. So we all feel thoroughly intimidated. Niall, when did you start writing this book? Did you have a seed of this idea before COVID-19, or did you go into lockdown and think, I have to write a book about this?
Well, a lot of people clearly sat down and wrote books last year, including you, Gillian. And I can give advance notice to the politics and prose community that Gillian's book is brilliant. And actually my favorite of your books is something to look forward to, out next month, I think, Anthrovision. I actually wanted to write a book about disasters before COVID-19 began, and had started work on a history of the future that was going to look at the way in which people had imagined the end of the world in the period really when science fiction gets going as a genre. I'd spent a lot of my adult life ignoring science fiction. I'd been very addicted to it as a teenager. Then I stopped reading it and became a kind of monomaniac historian. But it hit me recently that if you're trying to think about historical change, knowing history tells you a lot, but it's very bad at helping you think about future technological discontinuities. So I went back to science fiction a couple of years ago and went through a kind of mad reading phase, telling everybody that I met that they needed to read more science fiction. This might have been a consequence of moving to the West Coast. At any event, I was trying to persuade my editor in New York that I should write this book, and he was giving me strange looks. But then nature intervened and a disaster struck. And I remember thinking around about the first week of January or the second week of January, this is it. One of those science fiction scenarios that I've been thinking so much about, because there are lots of pandemics in recent science fiction, in Margaret Atwood, for example. This is it. It's happening. So I began kind of manically reading about what was happening in China and couldn't really think about anything else. Was compiling an enormously long PowerPoint deck to keep track of everything and sending it to my friends who probably thought I'd lost my marbles. But it was all kind of taking shape. But before the pandemic gave me the opportunity to go for something slightly different, which is a general history of disaster, an attempt to put it all into some kind of historical perspective, which I found strangely consoling as an activity. It's certainly better than watching Netflix.
Well, I find this fascinating. By the way, I should say that if anybody watching wants to ask questions, I'm going to do a slightly different take on the normal discussion. And I'm going to say, start sending in your questions then right now. Use the Q&A function if you can, because I want to weave them into the conversation as we go along. I can't see who's watching. You can't wave your hands at me or fall asleep or look excited at certain points. So the only way I can tell what you guys are interested in is to start sending me questions now, and I'll weave them in. But it's very interesting because, Neil, you say you started thinking about this in January. As it happens, you and I and many other journalists were in Davos together at the World Economic Forum in January, at a time when 7,000 or more of the global, nomads of today, if not the global elite, were packed together in a small series of rooms after whizzing around in airplanes, along with a delegation from Wuhan and elsewhere. And people were incredibly blasé about the risks, weren't they? I mean, did you go around Davos that January thinking, I've got to wear a mask or I've got to be careful?
Well, I certainly didn't have a mask, but I was filled with foreboding because I had been in Asia just before. I'd actually been on a short visit to Taiwan, to Hong Kong, and to Singapore. And I'd heard people talk about what was happening in Wuhan in ways that were a great deal more alarming than the World Health Organization's bland bulletins approved by Beijing. So I was pretty anxious about it. And I think I'd even written the first column about it around about the week of Davos. But what amazed me when I got there was that was almost absent from the discussions. The agenda, of course, had been set long before, was heavily focused on climate change, as all the top risks in the global risk report the World Economic Forum had just produced were climate related. And I couldn't really get many people to engage with me when I said, I think there might be a slightly more imminent disaster than climate change that's already begun. It was odd because I kept bringing this up in the discussions I was part of and getting the strange looks you get when you're a little bit ahead of the crowd. It was unnerving, especially as I started to feel ill around about that time and got steadily more ill after I returned to the United States. But of course, I couldn't get tested because even here at the Stanford campus, at the cutting edge of science and technology, there was absolutely no capacity to test for this strange new disease. So I'll never know if I actually had COVID-19. I might have been a super spreader. And I say this in the book because I think it's important to confess one's own cognitive difficulties. I was really worried about this. And at the same time, I was still traveling. I had a mask on one trip after Davos, but I remember taking it off after an hour because it was so bloody uncomfortable. So I think I was kind of ahead of the curve of cognitive dissonance that a lot of us ended up in the course of 2020.
Well, I must say it's funny because, I mean, frankly, if you were a super spreader, I was probably a super spreader too, in the sense that I, like you, bounce around madly, as have been the practice in recent years. I'm sure many people watching have had careers, or their families had careers where they've been doing the same thing. And I, like you, became very ill a couple of weeks after Davos, as did a great friend of mine who was there with me and our kids. We all went away on holiday. And we didn't really put two and two together for quite a long time and thought maybe we had had COVID ourselves too. And in fact, it wasn't until Jamie Dimon made a joke saying he dreamt that Davos was a super spreader moment that we began to think, gosh, maybe we've all had Davos and been spreading it. Why do you think we had such cognitive dissonance? And above all else, given that the Asian governments were already talking about it early last year, why didn't America and the European governments scramble to learn the lessons from things like SARS and other earlier pandemics?
Well, this is one of the central questions that I try to grapple with in the later part of the book, which, by the way, just to be clear, is not a book about COVID-19. It's only towards the end of the book that I get into our current disaster. One of the things that's really strange about what happened last year is that on paper, the United States and the United Kingdom were very well prepared for a pandemic in the kind of global pandemic preparedness rankings. And on paper, there was lots of evidence that the health bureaucracy on both sides of the Atlantic was prepared. Any number of reports and pandemic preparedness PowerPoint plans, it's all there. And I remember wading through it when I was writing the book. It's just that none of it actually worked. And I think the tempting explanation, which a lot of journalists wrote last year, was that it was all the fault of Donald Trump. We had an incompetent president, and therefore we ended up having excess mortality. Now, in the book, I make it clear that I think he made a great many mistakes, and I don't spare him from criticism, but I don't think it's true to say that that's why there was excess mortality, or at least it's not the only reason by any means. And I think it's worth reflecting that quite a lot of the excess mortality would probably have happened anyway, whoever was president, because there was such a bad failure at the level of the public health bureaucracy, and not just in the US. It seems to have been a failure in numerous democracies. What did they get wrong? Well, I think we can answer that best by looking at the countries that got it right. Taiwan, right next to China, South Korea, not far away. Those countries in particular did three things very right. The first thing they did was to ramp up testing capability. Very quickly, they made it possible to find out who had the new disease. Secondly, they had a system of contact tracing that enabled them to find out who had met anybody who tested positive. And then they had a system of quarantining and isolating people who were infected or suspected of being infected. And that worked. It worked so well that I think to date, just 11 people have died of COVID in Taiwan. And the number in South Korea is, by the standards of the US or the UK, trivially small. So I think the first thing that went wrong was that we forgot something that the great epidemiologist Larry Brilliant said years ago in a very excellent TED talk. The key to success in a pandemic is early detection and early action. And in fact, we did neither. We dithered around. And I remember going to Washington in February, which was at the time of a Hoover Institution board meeting, trying to convey to people in the administration that I thought they were being far, far too complacent about what was coming. And that was February. I mean, a month after we'd been coughing away post-Davos. And it was still very difficult to persuade people that there was going to be a very, very serious wave of infection, illness, and death in the United States. It wasn't actually till mid-March that governments on both sides of the Atlantic suddenly realized that they had missed the opportunity to contain the spread of the virus and decided to embark on what we called lockdowns for short, in an attempt to stop a crisis of the health systems of the sort that had happened in North Italy. So we were just very, very slow to realize what was happening. And I don't think one can pin that all on Trump any more than one can pin it all on Boris Johnson.
No, absolutely not. And the reason why it's interesting to talk about this political aspect is because we, of course, are talking courtesy of Politics and Prose in Washington, which is very much a policy-making community. And in many ways, the reason I started by talking about COVID is because although your book isn't about COVID, it cuts to really one of the key elements or key themes of your book, which is that we think today in the 21st century that science can answer our problems, if not science fiction. And yet, in a sense, you're saying that science is worth naught if we don't think about systems and the social structures in which they exist. Is that a fair snapshot of the key message of the book? That we need both the techie and the fuzzy type of analysis, if you like?
One way of answering that question is to say that in any contagion, including a pandemic, but it could also be true of an online contagion, there are really two things you need to understand. One is the pathogen itself, or the meme, if we're talking about something that goes viral online, that has certain properties. But you also need to understand the social network that it attacks. And it was the structure of the global social network that made this pandemic so disastrous. Because of the low dispersion factor that characterizes the virus SARS-CoV-2. A lot of the spreading is done by a minority of infected people. So it's something like 20% of infected people do 80% of the spreading. And it was obvious quite early on that this gave certain events a distinctively dangerous character, including conferences in ski resorts, but a variety of other things. Cruise liners got a lot of attention. There were a bunch of other places where this disease was just calculated to spread rapidly. I think to understand what was happening, it wasn't enough to be a really good virologist. You also had to have network science to see where it was going to most likely spread the fastest. And that was where I was quite fortunate, because my last book, The Square and the Tower, had been really an attempt by an historian to import network science into the study of the human past. And there's another broader theme which is relevant here. There's a way of telling the history of humanity, and particularly the history of medicine, as a sort of story of triumph, where we make one great discovery after another, and men, mostly men with microscopes, kind of crack each successive problem that we face until we've sort of solved the problem of infectious disease. And when I started to think about this, I realized that was a mistaken kind of Whig interpretation of history, because in reality, we would take two steps forward scientifically, but then one step back because of what we've come to call casually globalization. So we were understanding the world better in terms of medical science in the 19th and 20th century, but we were also making it more and more interconnected with every passing year. So we were increasing our vulnerability, even as we were getting a little bit better at understanding the pathogens that were out to get us.
Well, that's a very interesting point. I must say, I mean, I write in my own book that we have a contagion problem in the modern world because we are so tightly interconnected as a system that germs and political tumult and economic shocks can wither around the world, and yet we don't have a contagion of mutual understanding of how that happens always. But I'm curious though, I mean, one of the themes that emerges from your book is that every catastrophe, almost every catastrophe by definition, has shocked the elites. You give the example of World War I, you give the example of Vesuvius, you give the example of the terrible famines in the Soviet Union. There's always been a lack of preparation. But the irony is, of course, that in the modern world we have all these tools to monitor what's happening. Do you think we're getting any better at predicting disasters than before?
Well, I don't think disasters can be predicted. I mean, most of them can't, because if you just look at the ways in which the really big disasters happen, and whether we're talking about natural disasters like pandemics or man-made disasters like wars, it doesn't really make much difference. They don't have a distribution which allows us to attach probabilities ex ante to them. That they're either random, wars seem to be pretty randomly distributed, or they follow a power law, which means that you can't really tell when a really big one will be along. And so it's something of a doomed enterprise to try to predict when the next big earthquake will be on the San Andreas fault line. I hope it's not now, because it would really disrupt this conversation. We can't get better at predicting these black swans by definition, and the same applies to a wide range of different forms of disaster. I mean, we've kind of forgotten how disruptive really big volcanic eruptions can be, because we haven't had a really big one since Tambora in 1815. But good luck predicting when there'll be another really big volcano. That means that our predicament as a species is that we live under much greater uncertainty than's entirely comfortable. But what we can get better at is responding quickly to a disaster, because we can get information much faster than they could in 1815, and then taking advantage of what we know about social networks to try to address problems. And one of the things we failed to do last year, and it's kind of puzzling when you think about it, is we really failed to take advantage of technology in the US. We could have had contact tracing as just as good as the contact tracing in places like Taiwan and South Korea, but we just chose not to. Again, this isn't something that you can trace to the White House. I think the big tech companies took a conscious decision not to go down the road of nationwide contact tracing for reasons that are still a little murky to me, because it's not like they couldn't. I mean, it's not as if they didn't have the ability to graph the social networks of every American to a very, very high level of detail. But that was another of the sins of omission that produced the disaster. What we were able to do was to track the spread of the virus. You could just watch people going on spring break to Florida and then spreading the virus to the rest of the country last year. But we didn't do anything about it. We didn't actually take advantage of the technology in the way that some of the Asian countries did. And that's one of those parts of the story that still puzzles me slightly, because it's one of those things that didn't happen but could have.
Do you think part of the problem was just extreme hubris? Or prejudice on the part of the US or UK leaders, that they thought, I mean, because I write back to my book that, you know, when Ebola happened, everyone thought, oh, well, it's just out there in Africa, we can kind of ignore it, it won't ever come to us. And all the lessons that were learned in Ebola, which were incredibly relevant to COVID, were just ignored. And more importantly, the lessons that, as you say, that people had already learned in Asia and were applying in Asia were also ignored. Do you think it's hubris that has just caused the American and British governments to ignore those lessons?
I think that if one asks why did Taiwan and South Korea get it right, the answer is that they'd really understood the implications of SARS and MERS. And I don't think their counterparts in the public health bureaucracies in UK and the US had done that. And I'm noticing in the Q&A, people pushing back on the question of responsibility at the top. And let me make it clear, I'm very, very critical in the book of the way that Trump handled it. But I think if we conclude that it was all his fault, and if we'd had a different president, we'd have done much better, we're not going to understand what went wrong properly. I mean, remember, Ron Klain, who's Joe Biden's chief of staff, acknowledged in 2019 that if swine flu in 2009 had been as deadly as COVID, it would probably have been as big a disaster. And I think the reasons for that lie in the way that our public health bureaucracy has thought about pandemic preparedness for some years. And it's not always been this way. And I try to show that in the 20th century, the pandemic response, say in 1957, 58, was a good deal nimbler and I think more efficient and effective than the response this time around. At the heart of this problem is a general problem that I try to talk about in the context of other disasters. And that is the problem of the way that bureaucracies work. That over time, there's a tendency to get into a mode of preparedness that generates a lot of paper and a lot of PowerPoint slides and gives the illusion of preparedness, but actually doesn't actually provide the reality of it. There's a moment, and it struck me very forcibly when it was pointed out to me in 2018, when the Undersecretary for Pandemic Preparedness, a man named Cadleck, says in a lecture in Texas, if we don't get ourselves really better organized, we'll be SOL if there is a pandemic. And I didn't actually know at that point what SOL meant, but it was explained to me by an American friend that it means shit out of luck. So the guy whose job it was to do pandemic preparedness was kind of admitting that he knew it wouldn't really work if there were a pandemic. So that's the thing that interests me, that the guy in the kind of middle ranks of the bureaucracy, whose one job it is to do pandemic preparedness, who knows that all the reports and all the PowerPoint decks and all the legislation that there was won't actually amount to a hill of beans if there is a genuine emergency. That's the pathology that interests me, because you find it in other disasters too. And the point of the book is to kind of have a general theory of disaster that you can apply to all kinds of disaster. The reason that the subtitle is The Politics of Catastrophe is that I think that all disasters, even the ones we think of as natural, are ultimately politically determined, i.e. it's human decisions that determine how big the net body count is, how big the excess mortality is. And that I think we don't do ourselves any favors if we decide that this is a simple story of bad populist leaders, and if we only avoid electing them, we won't have the same problems again in future. That I think would be the wrong conclusion to draw.
Right. Well, I will just quickly tackle that issue head on, because we do have a question, actually. We've got some great questions coming through, and do please keep sending them through, saying that you don't understand how you can say that Trump isn't to blame because he didn't ramp up testing quickly, slow to start system of contact tracing, and encouraging quarantining. And they point out that some people, like the epidemiologists at the NHS, did see the problem coming, and Trump just wasn't listening to that. Do you think it would have been different under say, if we'd had Clinton? Or do you think that Biden deserves credit for having changed policy? And then I will turn to the other questions which are less specific to current politics.
Well, like all counterfactual questions, we can't really know. And as I said, I make it very clear that Trump made multiple mistakes and clearly didn't understand the problem that he was confronting at all well. What was odd, though, was that in January, when he did one thing right, which was to realize that we should limit travel from China, he was roundly criticized in the media. Now, that travel ban was days too late to be effective, and it wasn't nearly comprehensive enough, but at least instinctively, he was trying to do one right thing. The problem with testing was not Trump's doing. It was the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, that fundamentally prevented from testing from being ramped up. Not only did they try and centralize it and prevent others, including in the private sector, from making tests available, to make matters worse, they actually produced a test that didn't work. I think it's a stretch to say that that was Trump's doing, in the same way that it can't really be Trump's fault that the big tech companies opted not to do a serious contact tracing app. I know this because I was talking to people who developed a contact tracing app that couldn't get it onto the App Store. So I think this is a much more complex story than, say, in Jim Fallow's article in The Atlantic last year, in which he compared Trump to a pilot and essentially said the whole thing is pilot error. I mean, that's a gratifying thing to write if you loathe Trump. But if you think being the president of the United States is like flying a small plane, you don't really know enough about how politics works. In truth, the president is not the person making decisions about testing any more than the prime minister in the United Kingdom is. So right. It must be possible to say that Trump was an imbecile in his analysis and response, but that there were other reasons why we had excess mortality in the US. And I think the counterfactual that without Trump, we wouldn't have had this disastrously high death toll is just not plausible. Too many things went wrong within the public health bureaucracy for that to be right. So it's a bit like the way in which other disasters in history, including military disasters, get blamed on the person at the top. Harry Truman was right that the buck stops with the president, but it's not the case that the president is therefore responsible for everything that goes wrong. You have some responsibility as the commander-in-chief, but it wasn't Winston Churchill's doing that Singapore fell. And that's the kind of theme that I try to develop in the book. Ultimately, the complex things that we call modern polities, modern states, aren't simply one man in a plane. I mean, it's much more elaborate than that. And the point of failure in a disaster is rarely right at the top. The Titanic didn't sink because the proprietor of the White Star Line was a ruthless, blood-sucking capitalist. I mean, that's the sort of wrong account of what went wrong with Titanic, any more than the Challenger space shuttle blew up because President Reagan wanted to mention it in a State of the Union address. We've got to steer clear of those simplistic explanations of disaster because we'll miss where the real point of failure lies.
Right. Well, there's an interesting question from Mitch Epstein, who's watching, who says, there is new data to show that countries led by populist leaders performed worse on COVID-19, particularly when you look to people like Bolsonaro and people like that. How do you reconcile this with what you said about not being the fault of populist leaders? Is it just coincidence or correlation?
Well, if you look at the excess mortality numbers for last year, actually the worst cases were not the countries with populist leaders. I mean, Belgium had a tremendously bad experience at a time when its prime minister was a liberal woman, Sophie Wilmès. Peru has had tremendously high excess mortality, but that's not really a case where you could say a populist was at fault. I agree that the populist leaders made any number of mistakes, Bolsonaro perhaps outdoing Trump, and who knows, Modi may ultimately outdo both of them. But ultimately, this is not the right story to tell of what went wrong last year. Something much more profoundly went wrong in countries really with all kinds of different political systems, which went right in a relatively few countries. And I think if we go back to what did Taiwan get right, we arrive at, I think, a more interesting story. Why was it that the public health bureaucracy in most of the world didn't fully appreciate what a coronavirus could do? Why were, I think, most of the public health bureaucracies in the West sort of ready for an influenza pandemic, but not really ready for a coronavirus pandemic? Those are the questions to ask. And I think we must resist the temptation to turn this into a simple politics morality play, tempting though that is, because if we do that, we're going to fail to fix the things that are broken. And there's something definitely broken about a system that is very prepared for disaster on paper, but actually can't cope with the disaster when it happens. This is where the distinction between the grey rhino that you see coming towards you from very far away and the black swan is relevant. For some reason, we had predictions about pandemics year after year after year. People kept predicting pandemics. And yet when one actually happened, we all acted like it was a black swan. That can't be blamed, I think, just on incompetent populist leaders.
Right. Well, that's a great point, because we have someone watching, Kenneth Broad, who's pointed out that Nassim Taleb has stated that COVID was explicitly not a black swan because it was predictable, just as Larry Brilliant's TED Talk has said. And you sounds like you would agree with that. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it was a sort of misuse of the term to say this is a black swan, a bit like those journalists who said this is unprecedented, a word which I've now come to realize means I didn't study history. It was very precedented. We'd had actually a number of major pandemics just in the space of the previous century and a bit, and yet we all acted, or at least a lot of coverage was phrased as if this was something completely new, and it really wasn't. I mean, I wrote a piece that just came out in the Wall Street Journal, taking one of the highlights, I think, of the book, showing that there was a comparably large pandemic in 57, 58. Globally, I mean, the Asian flu of that time killed about the same proportion of the world's population as COVID has so far. I think COVID will actually do more in the end, but up until this point, they're very similar. But the responses were very, very different indeed. I mean, part of what makes COVID an interesting disaster is not just the excess mortality. It's the fact that we had this enormous economic disruption consequent on lockdowns. And that means that the economic cascade, the financial consequences of that in turn magnify the overall historical impact. It's not just a matter of counting up the bodies and saying this was a very big disaster in terms of excess mortality. It's also been very, very disruptive in other ways too. I think it's worth thinking about why that was, because it certainly wasn't the case in 57, 58, where there was absolutely nothing resembling a lockdown.
Fascinating. That's really fascinating. Well, one question, I mean, by the way, I think the 57-58 article is terrific. Anyone who's not read it, I'd recommend it. Even though I work for the FT and I'm recommending people to go and read a piece on the Wall Street Journal's site, but it is a great article and a great argument about the comparisons with 57-58. We have a very interesting question, though. If we're talking about politics, rather than just talking about leaders, Elliot Wilner says, on the part of the government, if the population is not willing to be led, leadership is greatly handicapped. The citizens of Taiwan and South Korea could be persuaded to comply with testing, contact tracing, and quarantine, but not the citizens of the US or the UK. Do you think the issue then is really about culture, the kind of stuff that I study as an anthropologist, rather than the issue of the political structures per se?
Well, it's a great question, and one that I delve into in the book, because there's some fascinating literature on this. I don't think it's true to say, as Eliot does, that the citizens of the US and the UK couldn't be persuaded to comply with testing, contact tracing, and quarantine, because we didn't really try. I mean, there really was such a limited attempt to make testing available at the beginning that I was running around seeking tests in vain. Nobody really tried to make contact tracing happen. And oddly enough, the explanations for that kept being given to me were, well, because of our love of freedom, we can't possibly agree to a contact tracing app. And I said, well, is it because of your love of freedom that you're agreeing to be under house arrest, which is what people in California effectively were once the shelter-in-place orders were issued? And the odd thing is that we submitted to far greater infringements of our individual liberty in the US than people had to in Taiwan, where the amount of government intervention, as you can see, if you look at the Blavatnik schools register, its measure of stringency, was much, much less. So this never really convinced me. It didn't seem to me that people, in agreeing to lockdowns, which we did on both sides of the Atlantic very readily, were exhibiting a great Anglo-Saxon spirit of freedom, rather the reverse. I mean, I think these arguments about culture don't get you very far if you were implying something that's very long-lasting, because clearly the spirit of 1957-58 was completely different. Same country, completely different response, acceptance of some mortality risk, minimal limitations on economic activity, no school closures. I mean, it's the same country, but people behaved in a completely different way. I think what's interesting in the US case, is a little less true in the UK, is the way that everything got politicized, from mask wearing to vaccination, in a very counterproductive way. And again, I don't think that's something that's culturally embedded. I think that's actually of quite recent provenance, the tendency for everything to become political.
Yeah, well, I must say, I mean, I much agree, having looked at culture. And for me, I wrote a column back in sort of March or April 2020 saying, what a pity it is that New Yorkers will never embrace masks, because all this research from anthropologists in Asia shows that masks are not just useful at stopping germs, they also act as a cultural and psychological prompt to change your behavior and signal your allegiance to other people in terms of civic norms. And I was completely wrong, because culture changes. And today you can't step outside without a mask in New York. But that leads into another question, a great question from Jim Bracker, which says, some communities severely sanction dangerous behavior, i.e. force everyone to have civic mindedness when they operate in terms of making sure they look out for others. Other communities have trouble even being serious about driving while impaired, i.e. don't appear to care about other people because it's all about individualism. Is there a way we can move from one to the other? Can you use policy to change cultural behavior in a positive sense? Is that what history suggests in any way?
I think what's interesting is that if you look at the history of disasters, there's enormous variance in the way that the public responds in any particular country that you care to choose. If we thought of people in the English-speaking world as tremendous individualists and libertarians, which is the kind of conventional way that they're represented, it's very hard to explain the behavior in the world wars, when there were drastic limitations on personal freedom in both world wars, and intrusions into almost every kind of personal liberty that were accepted as legitimate under the conditions of the emergency. And I think that's a really important concept that we haven't entirely understood, partly because wartime in the last 20 years has meant something different. Because we've fought smallish wars with a highly professional force to which most of us are not connected, we've forgotten what world wars were like. When the pandemic came along, there was a reluctance to declare it an emergency, not only at the national level, but even the World Health Organization held back. But the declaration of emergency is an important signal in a free society that temporarily the norms are going to be suspended. Individual liberties are going to be limited. What's important about this is that the emergency has to end. The problem is we've rather overused states of emergency, in the US particularly, and tend to sort of just let them carry on. This has been going on for a while. It's a feature of life, certainly since 9/11. But I think what we've forgotten is that this notion that the emergency is a discrete thing. And during that period of emergency, you can't expect individual liberties to be as normal. Think of, don't you know there's a war on? I mean, I've been very struck talking to members of the wartime generation by their sang-froid often in the face of this pandemic. My mother, who is now in her 80s, responded with remarkable stoicism to essentially being under house arrest in a village in Oxfordshire for most of the last year. And I came to realize that if you'd been through World War II, this was not really a particularly impressive emergency compared with, let's face it, the experience of aerial bombardment by the Luftwaffe. So I think that's the answer to the question. What we don't want is a society which is in a permanent state of emergency. That would be China. And one of the wrong conclusions that I've seen drawn by many commentators is that we should somehow learn from the People's Republic of China how this should be done. Now, that was part of what led to the lockdowns back in March last year, a sense that they'd shown us how to do it. Actually, we're not capable of doing things as repressive as the PRC did back in late January, February, and into the middle of last year, because we don't have a system in which in every apartment block there's a Communist Party member ready to inform on anybody who doesn't follow the rules. So the last thing we want is to end up there with a permanent state of emergency. What I'm really impressed by, and this is something that hasn't had nearly enough public discussion, is how the Republic of China, Taiwan, did this. And my new hero, Gillian, is Audrey Tang, the digital minister, a transgender cyberpunk figure who was brought into the Taiwanese government with a mandate to use technology to empower citizens. And that's what they've understood, and we haven't understood. But there's a way of doing this, a way of doing contact tracing that empowers citizens by giving them the information they need and doesn't create some kind of Orwellian panopticon.
That's absolutely fascinating. I'm going to turn in a few moments to some of the questions people have about the wider implications of this beyond just the pandemic question. But before we do, there's a very interesting question here. Is Singapore's concept of contact tracing possible in the West? Because in Singapore, this is from Hampton Dejanet, the police were called in to view surveillance cameras and identify customers who had known wherever a known COVID-19 victim had been. And the credit cards were used to contact people as well. You know, people in America might say that's a gross invasion of personal liberties or privacy.
Yeah, Singapore's system actually wasn't that successful either, because they didn't actually get enough people to download the contact tracing app. Plus, they allowed a significant outbreak amongst the migrant workers in very crowded dormitories. So I don't think Singapore was the role model, actually. I think this might be a tougher question for me if Hampton had gone with South Korea, because the South Koreans definitely took advantage of financial data, for example, in ways that would have been very tough to get through in the US. But Taiwan is the case that interests me the most. And it was by sheer chance that I was there in January of 2020 and had a lot of discussions with the people who do their cyber security, because of course they have to be very wary of the cyber attacks from the mainland that are a permanent feature of life. They've got to be very careful not to create highly centralized databases of information. And so the goal there, I think, is to come up with a system that exploits technology but doesn't create power in the hands of the state, but actually gives it to the citizen. And that's where I think Audrey Tang is one of the most interesting, innovative people in the world today, because she's understood that we can do this in ways that aren't fundamentally hostile to civil liberties. The point I'd come back to, though, is that when we say, oh, we couldn't do that because of our love of liberty, we did agree to be under house arrest for weeks and weeks on end. We agreed to large-scale violations of liberty. In some states, you couldn't even go to the public parks or the beaches. Now, I don't know what you think liberty means, but if you're actually locked in your own home and you can't go for a walk without being told you're breaking the curfew, what kind of a liberty is that? I know personally, I'd far rather take the risk that my data might be misused, but at least have some sense of whether or not I've been in contact with an infected person. There are trade-offs here. And if we have a very simplistic notion of liberty, which I think may be informing this debate, we're going to unwittingly lose quite important liberties, but we'll be sitting there locked in our homes saying, at least they don't have my credit card data. I mean, really?
Well, listen, we got an interesting question here from Krista Minotti. What is your, or Krista Minotti, apologies if I mispronounce your name. What is your prediction about what the excess mortality from COVID-19 will eventually look like? Have the responses gotten better, or do key social organizations continue to respond in ways that allow the problem to grow? And we have, while you're thinking about that, a great connected question, I think, from, where are we, Colleen McGarvey, who says, what can we learn from the disaster in history? Any advice for the Biden administration based on these lessons?
Two great questions. We don't really know where this is going to land. For example, I looked today at the IHME projections for India. And the current death toll in India is somewhere in the neighborhood of 250,000. But IHME thinks that by the end of July, there could be 1 million people dead in India. The final death toll could be 6 million worldwide. We don't know. And to calculate excess mortality for India is extremely difficult. We may never really know because we don't have very accurate mortality data right now. But excess mortality is certainly the right way to think about this. And for those countries that are really out the other side, like the UK, we can now see that excess mortality was perhaps 20% above normal in 2020. There was a huge spike around about April, which was very abnormal. And yet, if one takes the longer view, it wasn't by any means the worst month of modern times. It was probably the worst month of the last 5 or 10 years, but it actually turns out that, for example, 1951 was a comparably bad year in Britain in terms of excess mortality because of a very severe influenza epidemic. So one of the points I try to make in the book is that when you talk in raw numbers, it sounds like a catastrophic event. And every death is a tragedy, so one can't downplay that. But if one takes a step back and asks, how does this compare with the great pandemics of the past? Well, it's 3 orders of magnitude smaller than the Black Death at this point, and not likely to come much past, I think, the 1957-58 event. Certainly, we're not going to be looking at 1918-19 in any scenario that I've seen, because the vaccines work. And as vaccination and natural infection combine, the pandemic has an end. There will be an end to this. And the excess mortality is not going to compare with the worst pandemics of the past. That's for sure. Okay, what do we learn from this? I think the most important lesson for any administration, and indeed any government, is that it is better to be generally paranoid than very specifically prepared for one scenario that you're very attached to. If we spend the next 5 years or 4 years talking constantly, as was the case at Davos, January 2020, about climate change and the risk it poses, we are going to be blindsided by some other form of disaster that will be faster acting. We often, nearly always actually, don't get the disaster we're prepared for. Why did Taiwan do well? It's not just that they learned the lesson from SARS and MERS. They're just used to being paranoid because they're right next door to the PRC, which claims ownership of their territory. Why did the South Koreans get it right? The same reason. They're right next door to a crazy person's regime. And Israel also did pretty well, apart from a spike last year, nailed vaccination. Why? Israel has to be generally paranoid. And I think general paranoia means that you're alert to all the possible things that can go wrong. And there are many. I mean, if there's one thing I learned from this book is how many forms disaster can take and how dangerous it is to myopically focus on just one scenario. So yeah, I think we've got into a habit of mind, which our pandemic preparedness illustrates very well, but it applies to other fields too, where we sit around drawing up very elaborate plans for particular risks that we focus on. Gillian, this must remind you of regulation of the financial system prior to 2008, right? It wasn't like banks weren't regulated. They were the most highly regulated institutions of the financial system. It was just that none of the regulations actually worked, but they were very voluminous. Basel had got ever more voluminous in its regulation of bank capital. It's just that the banks didn't have nearly enough capital. So I think we've got to get out of, and this would be a very important message for Joe Biden, get out of the bureaucratic mindset that produces 36-page pandemic preparedness plans and 100-page guidelines on bank capital adequacy. We need to get back to something that assesses risk more rationally and recognizes uncertainty. And that's the kind of risk that really covers, that's the kind of thing that disasters are covered by, things to which we can't actually attach a probability ex ante, but we have to be ready for.
Well, we are getting questions about some of these other risks, including the world of, crypto and digital finance. We have a question from people saying, should I sell my crypto?
Well, no, but apart from anything else, don't do it until you've had a long conversation with a decent accountant, because what's fascinating about crypto is that though they haven't quite worked out what to do about it as far as regulation is concerned, the US authorities certainly know that they can tax it. And so the minute you make a sale, you're going to be facing some capital gains bill of uncertain size. More seriously, I think we are in still a relatively early phase of a major financial revolution that makes sense when you consider what's happening to the legacy 20th century system of fiat currencies and public balance sheets. We're blowing out public finance in the US. We're exploiting to the maximum the status of the dollar as a reserve currency. And when you look at how that legacy system works in its core functions, you're still sort of paying bills and making bank transfers and waiting days for the funds to clear. If you want to make a payment to, as I often have to do, to someone in East Africa, to one of my wife's relatives, I'm always shocked by how I'm scalped by the intermediary. So the financial revolution is coming, A, because we are really abusing the legacy system, and B, because there are so many inefficiencies in existing forms of transaction. And so the smart thing is just to be long fintech, because some of these innovations are going to have staying power. I was initially a skeptic about Bitcoin. My teenage son converted me to think more constructively about it in 2017. I then became a convert to decentralized finance. And I'm broadly speaking a believer that the existing system is so moribund that there is clearly going to be a fundamental transformation in the nature of money and payments in the digital sphere. And it's probably too early to sell and take your profits on that. Not that you're going to, I'm not giving financial advice here, to be clear, because otherwise I'll have the regulators onto me.
Well, let me quickly, since we are talking from a Washington-based bookstore, we have a great question from Peter Gisela, who's asking, in 2016, Congressman Michael McCall wrote a book, Failures of Imagination, the Deadliest Threats to Our Homeland and How to Thwart Them. And it pointed out, it was really writing in the aftermath of thinking about 9/11, that actually there were other problems like the pandemics. Peter asks, have you read the book and his proposed solutions? Are these the kind of things that Washington could or should be doing right now to get better and learn from history?
I haven't read the book. I should read the book. I think the failure of imagination problem is absolutely the right one. Probably our biggest danger at the moment is that we allow our conversation, whether we're policymakers or running corporations or just ordinary voters trying to make a living, if we focus our conversation on one or two scenarios that we find particularly compelling, climate change and climatic disaster being number one at the moment, then we're almost certain to be blindsided by something else. And it's also very interesting to me that we kind of forget that other forms of disaster are much faster acting than climate change. Now, the book is not, let me be very clear, not a denying book. I actually think that climate change is a major source of danger. And I worry that we actually aren't addressing it meaningfully. Fact, 48% of the increase in CO2 emissions since Paris are due to China. But we make no real meaningful effort to constrain China. And until we do that, most of this conversation is actually pointless. But there are much faster acting ways of causing harm, and war is one of them. There is a very real risk that the US and China are on track for a big war. Many of the preconditions are already in place. That's why the last chapter of the book is about Cold War II and the possibility that it could become hot war, because historically wars have been almost as deadly as pandemics when it comes to killing really large numbers of people. And I don't think we're worrying enough about what that US-China war looks like. Remember, part of such a war would be cyber warfare. And we haven't really seen the full extent of cyber warfare yet. It's been really just the overture, if that, maybe just the tuning up that we've seen. But considering that we're having this conversation, like so many conversations you and I have had, Gillian, over the last year on Zoom, we've become wholly dependent on the internet. And a major outage of communications technology, which is a scenario in almost every war game that I've seen described, would throw us into a new and very sudden kind of crisis. So we've got to keep in mind that disaster takes multiple forms, and we've actually created new ways in which disaster can happen that the ancient Greeks didn't have to worry about. They did not have to worry about cyber warfare in the Athens of Pericles.
They did not have to worry about cyber warfare, and yet we can certainly learn things from the Greeks. I mean, it's been a fascinating conversation, Neil or Professor Ferguson. You are indeed, as I said earlier, one of Scotland's most erudite and prolific intellectual exports. And I guess I take away three key points. Firstly, that although it is indeed very easy to point the finger just at Donald Trump or Boris Johnson, it's not just a story about Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, no matter how terrible their many mistakes and failures were. Perhaps even the same thing could be said of some of the other populist leaders. Secondly, that this is not a problem that we can just solve with science. Science alone, science is necessary, but it's not sufficient in terms of dealing with these issues. We really do need to look at social structures and think about social networks, as you said. And thirdly, what's very clear from our conversation, and even more clear from the book, is that we really can benefit by learning from history and learning not just from each other around the world, which we need to do right now, but also learning by what has happened in the past and trying to find ways of, if not doing it better, being humble enough to recognize that we need to remain alert, adaptable, and take a long view of what's going on. So thank you very much indeed. It is indeed a fascinating book. I thoroughly recommend anyone who's not read it yet to have a look at it, because it is very lively indeed. And just the last thing to say is, what's your next book going to be about, Neil?
I have to write volume 2 of my biography of Kissinger. And so I've started work on that. And it is quite salutary to be transported back to the Nixon administration. They had a different form of disaster back then. And the biggest one was, of course, Vietnam. So yeah, more history to come. I want to just take the opportunity to thank everybody who posed a question. We got to some, but not all of them, but I made sure I looked at them all. Thanks so much. And thanks for tuning in. And thanks to Gillian for leading the conversation so brilliantly.
And thank you to Julia and the Politics and Prose bookstore for hosting this fascinating discussion. And over to you, Julia.
And we at Politics and Prose just want to go ahead and extend our thanks to Niall Ferguson, Gillian Tett, and our audience out there again for your really smart and engaging questions. Your patronage and dedication enable us to host these types of live events, and we simply couldn't do it without the book sales to support them. So we hope you'll follow the link in the chat to purchase your copy of Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, or just head on over to politics-prose.com. While you're there, feel free to check out our events calendar for everything else coming up this month. And from our shelves to yours, we hope you're out there staying safe, staying strong, and of course, staying well read.